It was the first day of fall when Miss Eliza May Harper walked down the dirt road toward Pine Hollow Elementary. The air was crisp, the leaves rustling like secrets in the trees. Her coat was pressed, her lesson plans folded neatly in her bag. But her shoes, once her mama's, were torn at the soles, each step letting cold and dust. Some children stared, some whispered, but Eliza kept walking. She had been through worse. Orphaned at 11, raised in a mission school, she knew how it felt to be overlooked. The pain didn't come from the dust on her feet. It came from the looks, the judgment, the smirks of parents standing outside, arms folded, pretending not to see. She stepped into the schoolhouse and smiled anyway. Her classroom waited. The blackboard was blank, the future unwritten. But her shoes, oh, they told a story no chalk ever could. Inside the schoolhouse, the wooden floors creaked beneath her steps. She greeted the children with warmth, masking the ache in her feet. Most were polite. A few were curious. But the older girls noticed the shoes. They giggled behind cupped hands, sharing looks like secrets passed in silence. Eliza taught through it. History lessons, reading practice, the rhythms of normalcy. She kept her eyes on the board, her voice steady. But during recess, she sat on the porch steps, quietly restitching the corner of her shoe with thread from her coat pocket. A deputy walked by, chewing straw, and smirked. "Ain't no lady got business looking like that," he muttered, just loud enough. She didn't reply. She just kept stitching, not for pride, not for vanity, but because every child deserved a teacher who showed up, even if the town made her feel like she didn't belong. That evening, as the children ran to their wagons and parents, Eliza lingered by the schoolhouse door. Her hands were stained with chalk and thread. She watched them leave, most not even glancing back. But one small boy, Samuel, waved. He was new, barefoot. He understood silence. When the yard was empty, Eliza walked home. A small cabin behind the chapel. One window cracked, firewood stacked in a tired pile. She lit a candle, boiled a kettle, and soaked her feet in warm salt water. Then she opened her journal. Day 1, she wrote. I taught without shame. But her hands trembled. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, rain tapping the roof like footsteps. Outside, the wind howled. And Eliza, alone but not broken, prayed not for new shoes, but for strength to wear the old ones one more day. Because hope, sometimes, walked barefoot through fire. The Sunday service was always crowded in Pine Hollow. The pews smelled of old wood and strong perfume. Eliza sat near the back, quiet as ever, wearing the same faded dress and patched shoes. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, of walking in love. But the eyes of the congregation were sharper than the gospel. As folks exited the church, Eliza heard the whispers. One woman muttered, "She dresses like sorrow." Another added, "Can't believe they let her teach our kids." The sheriff stood nearby, arms crossed, saying nothing. His eyes met Eliza's briefly. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But he didn't look away either. And that silence, it said more than the sermons ever could. Eliza left the service without a word. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply walked away, her steps slow, her shoes dragging through the gravel path like soft thunder. In town, the bakery had placed its pies on the windowsill. Eliza walked by, stomach growling. She had 1 coin left in her pocket, but she kept it. A teacher's pay was thin, and winter was coming. A group of children from her class spotted her and pointed. "She lives in the chapel yard," one boy whispered. "Heard she eats cornmeal 3 times a day." Another laughed and said, "Bet her shoes talk back at night." Eliza didn't scold them. She just kept walking. Because their words weren't truly their own. They echoed the thoughts of their parents. And maybe the town. She stopped by the notice board near the post office. A sign read, "Winter Coat Drive. Help the needy." She smiled at the irony. The needy were not always those with empty hands. Sometimes, they were the ones still giving while their own cup was nearly dry. Back at her cabin, Eliza lit the fire and sorted old exam papers. Her feet throbbed. She peeled off the torn shoes and sighed. There were only a few more weeks until the holiday break. Maybe then she could visit the city, get new shoes, maybe even a dress. But for now, the echo of mocking laughter clung to her like smoke. That night, as she sat beside the fire, she heard a knock on the chapel door. Strange, for this hour. She stepped outside, heart racing. But it was only the sheriff. Standing still, no words spoken, just holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. He didn't hand it to her. He left it on the porch, tipped his hat, and walked off into the night. Eliza picked it up. Inside, fresh thread, a strong needle, and a note that simply read, "Don't quit." The next morning, Eliza rose before the sun. The night's wind had calmed, leaving dew on her windowsill. She held the sheriff's box in her lap, staring at the note again. Just 2 words, "Don't quit." But it felt like an entire sermon. She took her shoes and, with careful hands, began stitching. Every pass of the needle was a kind of prayer, not just for the shoes, but for herself. The fabric was tired, but the thread was strong. She worked until her fingers ached, until the soles held firm. Then, with her patched shoes on, she walked to school as the sky turned gold. Her steps were quiet but sure. Along the way, a rancher's wife crossed paths with her and nodded stiffly. Eliza returned the nod. She didn't need their approval. She only needed the strength to keep walking. Patched shoes, tired sole, and all. At school, something was different. The children were louder, bolder. One student drew a picture of a teacher with big feet and ripped shoes and passed it around. Laughter echoed through the room like breaking glass. Eliza took the drawing without a word, folded it gently, and placed it in her pocket. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Instead, she handed out books and moved forward with the lesson. Later that day, while they painted autumn trees, little Samuel came to her desk with a drawing of his own. It was a stick figure wearing a big smile and a crown made of books. Underneath it, he wrote, "Miss Harper is strong." She didn't say anything, but her hand touched his gently before he ran off. In that moment, one kind word undid the sting of 10 harsh ones, just enough to keep going. As dusk settled over the hills, Eliza sat outside her cabin, watching the wind pull leaves from the oak trees. The note from the sheriff sat on her lap. She didn't understand why he cared. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just didn't like cruelty. Either way, it mattered. That evening, she penned a letter to no one in particular. "They mocked my shoes," she wrote, "but not my heart, not my mind. I still teach. I still believe." She tucked the letter into her Bible. A reminder. Later, she heard the sound of boots on gravel. She stood up, startled, but saw no one. Only the faint glimmer of a lantern near the schoolhouse. She watched it flicker, unsure who it was. But she felt, deep down, that someone out there still believed in goodness. Still believed in her. And that, somehow, made her shoes feel whole again. Winter crept in with brittle mornings and silver air. Frost lined the window panes of the schoolhouse, and the children came bundled in thick coats and mittens. All except Eliza. Her coat was thin, her gloves homemade, and her shoes now wrapped in cloth for warmth. Still, she smiled every morning as she greeted her class. Behind her back, the whispers grew colder than the wind. If she can't take care of herself, how can she teach? One parent muttered after drop-off, but Eliza didn't shrink. She stayed an extra hour after school, cleaning the classroom, arranging books, even fixing the wobbly desk legs. Her presence was soft, but her persistence was loud. That kind of strength, quiet and steady, started to feel like rebellion. Not the kind with fists and fire, but the kind that rises each day and refuses to bow, even in worn shoes. That week, the mayor visited for a surprise inspection. He stood tall in his polished boots, looking down at the scuffed floors and simple posters. Eliza welcomed him with poise, offering tea in a chipped cup. He didn't drink. Instead, he glanced at her shoes and chuckled. "Times must be rough," he said with a smirk. Eliza replied with only her eyes, calm and unflinching. The children were watching, and even without a word, she taught them a lesson that day. Dignity isn't worn on your feet. When the mayor left, the room felt different. The students didn't laugh that afternoon. Instead, they worked harder, quieter. Maybe they understood something had passed between that woman in worn shoes and the man in shiny ones. Maybe they began to see her not just as a teacher, but as someone who carried storms and kept walking anyway. That Friday, just before dismissal, a strong wind slammed the schoolhouse door open. The sheriff stepped in, dusted with snow and grit. Everyone froze. He walked to the front of the room and looked at Eliza. "Need a word," he said. She followed him outside, children pressing their faces to the frosted windows. He handed her a sealed envelope. "From the county," he said. "Someone nominated you for the Teacher's Bravery Fund." She blinked. Wasn't me, he added. But I reckon whoever did sees what I see. He paused, then pointed at her shoes. Those tell a story, and I reckon it's one worth hearing. Then, without another word, he tipped his hat and walked off. Eliza stood in the cold, clutching the envelope. Inside, a letter said she'd been awarded a grant. Enough for new supplies, and maybe a pair of shoes. But she just smiled. The ones she wore had already made their mark. Monday morning, Eliza stood before her cracked mirror, the letter folded neatly beside her oil lamp. She had enough now, enough to buy boots, a coat, even a new dress. But as her fingers hovered over her old shoes, she hesitated. These shoes had walked through storms, ridicule, and loneliness. They had carried her through every day without complaint. She slipped them on like armor, lacing the cloth wraps over the stitching one last time. As she walked to school, her reflection followed her in every shop window. Some people nodded politely now. Others looked away, but the shoes kept going. When she entered the schoolhouse, the children stared at her feet. But not with laughter. Not this time. Something had shifted. Not just in them, but in her. The shoes were no longer a symbol of lack. They had become something sacred. A story. A witness. Later that week, Eliza received a package from the city. Inside, brand new leather shoes, polished and sturdy. But she didn't wear them. Not yet. She placed them beside her bed, as if honoring both the future and the past. That day, she taught a lesson on resilience. Not from a textbook, but from her own life. She told the class about people who faced rejection, ridicule, and hardship, yet stood tall. She never mentioned herself. But little Samuel raised his hand and asked, "Miss Harper, are you one of those people?" The room went quiet. Eliza looked around. Small hands clutched pencils. Wide eyes waited. And in that silence, she answered without words. She simply stepped to the chalkboard, wrote the word hope, and smiled. Her shoes didn't creak that day. They stood steady, like roots pressed deep into the ground of something she had earned. That evening, she sat on her porch, holding the new shoes in her lap. She brushed her hand across the smooth leather. They were beautiful, but a strange feeling welled up in her chest, grief for the old ones. The ones that had carried shame and courage together. She placed the new pair back in the box and leaned against the doorframe, sipping weak tea. Then she heard footsteps, measured and familiar. The sheriff stood by the chapel gate, holding a wide-brimmed hat in his hands. He walked slowly toward her. "Folks like you," he said quietly. "You don't just wear shoes. You walk through fire and come out with grace." Then, gently, he placed the hat on her head. "You earned this." Eliza didn't speak, but her eyes filled, not because of the gift, but because someone had seen her, not just her shoes, her soul. Eliza sat in the back row of a parenting workshop, hidden beneath dark sunglasses and a scarf wrapped tightly around her head. She didn't speak. She didn't raise her hand. She just listened. The topic was rebuilding broken bridges. The speaker, a child psychologist, spoke of guilt, redemption, and the difference between protecting a child and possessing them. Every word felt like it was aimed directly at her chest. When parents were asked to reflect on their mistakes privately, Eliza's paper remained mostly blank. Except for one sentence she wrote again and again. "I didn't protect her. I protected my image." When the workshop ended, she waited until everyone left before walking slowly to the front, placing her page into the feedback box with shaking fingers. She didn't leave her name. Outside, a mother approached her gently. "I watched your story on the ministry's archive," she said. "I thought I hated you, but then I realized I was you." The following week, a young reporter from a regional newspaper arrived unannounced. She was barely 20, with notepads filled with questions. She had heard of the orphaned teacher with torn shoes, who now wore a sheriff's hat and refused to quit. Eliza didn't want attention, but the girl was persistent. Finally, she allowed her in, on one condition. "You can write my story," she said, "but don't make it about pity. Make it about standing when everything tells you to sit." The piece went viral within days. Teachers across the state sent letters. Some sent shoes. One school named a corner of their library after her. But Eliza stayed the same. Every morning, she still walked the same road. Still taught with the same passion. Still carried the old shoes inside a small cloth bag, like a sacred memory. Because the story wasn't about the shoes, it was about the walk. One evening, the sheriff hosted a town hall. It was his final month before retirement. He stood at the podium, speaking slow and steady. Then he called Eliza to the stage. She hesitated, but the crowd clapped until she stood beside him. He looked out and said, "When the world gets too loud, watch the quiet ones. They're often the ones holding it all together." He turned to her and removed his badge, pressing it into her palm. "This town needs more than law. It needs grace. And you gave it." Eliza didn't cry, not in front of them. But when she returned home that night, she sat by her bed, the badge in one hand and her old shoes in the other. She whispered softly, "We made it." And in that silence, something deeper than applause filled the room. Something that sounded a lot like peace. Winter finally loosened its grip, and the fields beyond the school turned green again. Eliza walked through them on Sundays, hat tilted over her brow, her steps light. Spring felt different this year, like something had finally settled. In town, people nodded now. Some even smiled. The children had stopped laughing at her shoes. They had started asking her about dreams. "What did you want to be?" they asked. And Eliza told them the truth. "I never wanted to be rich. I wanted to be remembered for kindness." One afternoon, a girl named Abigail left a note on her desk. "I want to be like you," it said. Eliza folded it gently and placed it in her journal. That little note, those 7 words, meant more than all the awards or headlines. Because true legacy doesn't come in gold or fame. It comes in the hearts we change without even trying. By the end of the school year, something beautiful happened. The students planned a surprise. On the final day, they formed a line from the schoolhouse to her cabin. Each child carried something: a flower, a poem, a drawing. Together, they created a trail of color and love. Eliza followed behind them, one hand over her mouth, the other clutched to her chest. When she reached her porch, there was a wooden box waiting. Inside was a new pair of handmade leather boots and a carved wooden plaque. It read, "She walked so we could run." Her breath caught in her throat. She had spent so long feeling invisible, mocked, alone. And now the very children who once whispered behind her back were building bridges in her name. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That moment said everything. Even torn shoes could leave beautiful footprints. That night, she lit a lantern and sat by her window. The old shoes sat near the fireplace, still dusted with the earth of her journey. The sheriff's hat hung by the door. The badge lay beside her Bible. She closed her eyes and thought of her parents, of the mission home, of every door that closed and every room that welcomed her. Then she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for every young girl who might one day wear torn shoes and wonder if she mattered. "Let her find her strength," Eliza murmured. "Let her story be heard." Outside, the stars blinked above Pine Hollow, quiet as ever. But somewhere between those lights and the wind through the trees, a new chapter had begun, and it didn't need applause. It only needed the soft, steady sound of a woman walking home, with her head high. Years passed. The children Eliza once taught grew into young men and women, some farmers, some soldiers, some teachers themselves. But no matter how far they went, they spoke of the woman who taught them more than letters and numbers. They remembered the hat she wore, the way she walked with worn shoes and unshaken grace. Eliza never married. She never left Pine Hollow. And yet, her name traveled. A small-town girl who walked through mockery and stood taller than most. On her 65th birthday, the town held a celebration. They called it Harper Day. There was pie, music, and laughter. But the loudest applause came when the mayor unveiled a statue. It showed a young teacher standing tall, her shoes scuffed, her chin high, and a wide-brimmed hat on her head. At its base were just 5 words: "She taught us to rise." Eliza watched the ceremony from a wooden chair, wrapped in a shawl knitted by one of her former students. She didn't say much that day. She never did. But her eyes glistened. And when a small boy from the crowd ran up and handed her a drawing, she reached for it like it was treasure. It showed a teacher with wings on her feet. He had written, "You flew first, so we could fly too." She smiled. That night, she returned to her cabin. It still looked the same, but it had become something more, an anchor in a town that once doubted her. She placed the drawing in her journal. Then she stood in front of the mirror one last time and adjusted the sheriff's hat on her silver hair. "Still fits," she whispered. Not just the hat, but the meaning behind it. Strength, quiet dignity, respect earned. When Eliza passed away peacefully one autumn night, the town mourned like it had lost its heart. The church bells rang. Schools closed. Children wrote poems on scraps of paper and left them by her statue. But the sheriff's hat, still sitting by her front door, became something sacred. It was never claimed, never moved. It stayed right there, on a wooden hook, as if waiting. And maybe it was because legends don't leave, they echo. In Pine Hollow, every time a new teacher arrived, they visited her cabin. They touched the old shoes now framed in glass. They read her letters, carefully preserved. And before they ever taught a child, they stood quietly, hand on the sheriff's hat, and remembered. One woman, with torn shoes and an unshaken soul, had once taught the whole town how to walk with honor.